They called her Cupcake behind her back, a petite analyst who smiled too much and asked too many questions. When Lieutenant Colonel Hayes dismissed her from the strategy room with a condescending pat on the shoulder, he had no idea that the woman he just humiliated wore silver stars in a life he knew nothing about. 24 hours later, when a diplomatic crisis threatened to destroy everything his team had built, Iris Clark would reveal a truth that would leave him speechless and force an entire command to question everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman they'd spent months underestimating. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The conference room at the European Defense Analysis Center smelled of old coffee and institutional arrogance. Iris Clark sat in the back row, her notebook open, her pen moving steadily across the page as she documented the morning briefing with the kind of meticulous attention that her colleagues had learned to expect and ignore in equal measure. At 26, Iris had been with the center for 18 months, transferred from what her personnel file vaguely described as previous government service. She was small, barely reaching 5'3", with a face that seemed perpetually arranged in an expression of earnest curiosity. Her colleagues found her pleasant enough, helpful even, but ultimately forgettable. The kind of person who organized office birthday celebrations and always remembered to refill the coffee pot. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes stood at the front of the room, his British accent crisp as he outlined the center's role in the upcoming NATO strategic exercises. The center served as an analytical hub, processing intelligence and providing strategic recommendations to military leadership across the European theater. It was prestigious work, the kind that attracted ambitious officers and career diplomats who saw themselves as the intellectual backbone of continental security. Iris had been assigned to the Cultural Analysis Division, a department that most of the center's personnel viewed as tangential at best. While the military strategists and intelligence analysts dealt with what they considered real security issues, Iris and her small team were tasked with understanding regional cultural dynamics, language nuances, and social patterns that might impact operations. Important work, certainly, but not the kind that earned respect in a room full of people who measured their worth in tactical victories and strategic breakthroughs. Now, regarding the Balkans situation, Hayes continued, clicking to a new slide that showed a map of southeastern Europe. We've identified 3 potential flashpoints that could escalate within the next 6 months. Our intelligence suggests that nationalist groups in the region are becoming increasingly coordinated. Iris raised her hand tentatively. Hayes glanced at her with the kind of forced patience that teachers reserve for students who ask obvious questions. Yes, Clark? Sir, has anyone analyzed the linguistic patterns in the intercepted communications? I've noticed that some of the translations we've been working with may be missing important cultural context that could change our interpretation of the threat level. The room fell silent in that particular way that signals collective dismissal. A few officers exchanged glances. Someone in the third row suppressed a smile. Hayes cleared his throat. I'm sure your observations are noted, Clark, but we're focused on strategic analysis here, not semantics. The translators know their job. With respect, sir, it's not about semantics. Some of the phrases being used have very specific cultural meanings that don't come through in direct translation. What we're interpreting as coordination might actually be something quite different. Clark, Hayes said, his tone growing firmer, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but perhaps you should leave the strategic interpretation to those with operational experience. Your role is to provide cultural background when requested, not to second-guess intelligence analysis. Iris felt the familiar heat rising in her cheeks, but she kept her expression neutral and nodded. Yes, sir. As the briefing continued, she caught fragments of whispered conversation from the row in front of her. Bless her heart, she tries so hard, Captain Donovan muttered to his colleague. Hayes calls her Cupcake in the officers' lounge, the other man replied quietly. Says she's sweet and decorative but not particularly substantive. That's a bit harsh. Is it though? She's been here 18 months and the most significant thing she's contributed is organizing the Christmas party. Nice girl, but she's out of her depth with actual strategic work. Iris continued taking notes, her pen steady even as the words carved small wounds in her professional pride. This wasn't the first time she'd heard variations of this conversation. In fact, it had become background noise to her daily existence at the center. The truth was that Iris had heard worse. Much worse. In places where the stakes had been infinitely higher and the consequences of being underestimated had meant the difference between life and death. But no one at the center knew about those places. No one knew about the life she'd lived before arriving at this comfortable analytical posting with its predictable routines and casual dismissals. After the briefing dispersed, Iris returned to her small office on the third floor. The space was barely larger than a closet, with a single window that overlooked the center's parking lot. Her desk was organized with the kind of precision that some of her colleagues found slightly obsessive. Files arranged by region and date. Reference materials in alphabetical order. A small plant that somehow thrived despite the fluorescent lighting. On her wall, almost hidden behind a filing cabinet, hung a framed photograph. It showed a group of people in civilian clothes standing in front of a nondescript building in what might have been Eastern Europe. Iris was in the photo, though she looked different somehow. Harder. More present. The kind of different that comes from experiencing things that fundamentally change how you occupy space in the world. She sat down and opened her computer, pulling up the files she'd been working on. The intercepted communications that Hayes had dismissed during the briefing scrolled across her screen. Iris read through them again, her training allowing her to see patterns that the official translations had completely missed. The phrases weren't coordination language. They were distress signals. Coded requests for help from someone trapped in a situation they couldn't escape. And unless she was very much mistaken, the person sending those signals was in immediate danger. Iris pulled up a separate file, one she kept encrypted and off the official network. Over the past few months, she'd been building her own analysis of the Balkans situation, cross-referencing official intelligence with cultural knowledge and linguistic expertise that her colleagues didn't know she possessed. The picture that emerged was completely different from the center's official assessment. There wasn't a growing nationalist threat. There was a hostage situation being disguised as political coordination. And the person being held was a European intelligence officer who'd been missing for 6 weeks, presumed dead. Iris stared at the screen, weighing her options. She could take this to Hayes, but he'd already made it clear that he didn't value her analytical contributions. She could try to go over his head, but without credibility in the command structure, she'd likely be dismissed again or worse, accused of overstepping her authority. Or she could do what she'd learned to do in another life, when she'd operated in places where official channels didn't exist and survival depended on trusting your training and taking action when action was needed. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her colleague Emma, one of the few people at the center who treated her as more than decorative furniture. Officers' lounge at lunch? I hear they're serving actual edible food for once. Iris smiled despite herself and typed back a quick confirmation. As she returned to her analysis, she caught sight of the photograph on her wall again. The woman in that photo wouldn't have hesitated. The woman in that photo had made impossible decisions in impossible situations and had the scars, visible and invisible, to prove it. The question was whether that woman still existed beneath the carefully constructed facade of Iris Clark, the helpful analyst who smiled too much and whose most notable contribution was organizing office parties. The morning of the strategic planning session arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Brussels feel almost cheerful. Iris walked into the center at her usual time, carrying the detailed analysis she'd spent the previous 3 nights preparing. The document represented dozens of hours of careful work, cross-referencing linguistic patterns, cultural context, and intelligence reports that most analysts would never think to connect. She decided to take a chance. If she could present her findings clearly enough, with enough supporting evidence, perhaps Hayes and the other senior officers would see past their preconceptions and recognize that the center's current Balkans assessment was dangerously flawed. The planning session was scheduled for 0900 in the main strategy room, where senior personnel from across the center would gather to finalize recommendations for the upcoming NATO exercises. Iris had never been invited to these sessions before, but she'd made a formal request through the proper channels, citing the relevance of her cultural analysis to the Balkans portion of the planning. To her surprise, the request had been approved. She'd taken it as a positive sign, evidence that maybe her persistent efforts to contribute meaningfully were finally being recognized. She arrived at the strategy room 15 minutes early, her analysis printed and bound, supplementary materials organized in color-coded folders. The room was already partially filled with officers reviewing documents and discussing preliminary findings. Iris found a seat near the middle of the table, close enough to be seen but not so prominent as to appear presumptuous. Captain Donovan entered and spotted her, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Clark? I didn't know you'd be joining us today." "I submitted a request to present some findings related to the Balkans assessment," Iris replied, keeping her tone professional and friendly. "Cultural analysis that might be relevant to the strategic planning." "Ah," Donovan said, his expression suggesting he found this mildly amusing. "Well, good for you. Always nice to have fresh perspectives." The condescension in his voice was barely masked, but Iris smiled and nodded, refusing to let it undermine her confidence. She'd faced far worse than workplace dismissal. She could handle a room full of skeptical officers. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes entered precisely at 0900, accompanied by 2 visiting officers from NATO Command. He scanned the room, his gaze pausing briefly on Iris before moving on without acknowledgement. The meeting began with a review of intelligence updates from various theaters, each senior analyst presenting their findings with the kind of authoritative confidence that came from knowing their audience valued their input. 45 minutes into the session, Hayes turned to the Balkans assessment. "Now, let's review our analysis of the southeastern European situation. Major Thornton, if you would present the intelligence summary." Major Thornton, a career intelligence officer with 20 years of experience, stood and began walking through the center's official assessment. Nationalist coordination. Rising tensions. Potential for escalation. The same conclusions Iris had heard in previous briefings, based on the same flawed translations and cultural misunderstandings. When Thornton finished, Hayes opened the floor for discussion. Several officers offered observations and questions. The conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of people who shared a common framework and vocabulary, who understood their roles and stayed within their designated lanes. Iris waited for an appropriate pause, then raised her hand. Hayes noticed but continued addressing a question from one of the NATO visitors. After several more minutes of discussion, he finally acknowledged her. "Yes, Clark. Did you have something to add?" "Yes, sir. I've prepared an alternative analysis of the Balkans situation that I believe presents important information that might change our strategic assessment." The room's energy shifted subtly. Not hostile, exactly, but decidedly skeptical. Hayes gestured for her to continue, his expression suggesting he was granting her an indulgence rather than requesting genuinely valued input. Iris stood and began distributing her prepared materials. "If you'll look at page 3, I've compiled linguistic analysis of the intercepted communications that form the basis of our current threat assessment. What I've found is that many of the key phrases we've interpreted as coordination language actually have very specific cultural meanings that suggest something quite different." She walked through her analysis systematically, pointing out translation errors, cultural context that had been missed, and patterns that suggested not nationalist coordination but coded distress signals. Her presentation was clear, well-organized, and backed by extensive evidence. The room listened with varying degrees of attention. Some officers reviewed her materials with genuine curiosity. Others barely glanced at the documents, their body language broadcasting their dismissal. When she finished, there was a brief silence. Then Hayes spoke, his tone carrying the kind of careful patience that adults use with children who don't understand why their ideas won't work. "Clark, I appreciate the effort you've put into this analysis. Truly. It's clear you've spent significant time on these materials." "Thank you, sir. However," Hayes continued, "I think you may be overinterpreting some linguistic nuances at the expense of the broader strategic picture. Major Thornton's assessment is based on intelligence from multiple sources, corroborated by field reports and signals intelligence. While cultural context is certainly valuable, we can't allow it to override operational intelligence. Sir, with respect, I'm not suggesting we ignore operational intelligence. I'm suggesting that our interpretation of that intelligence may be fundamentally flawed. If these aren't coordination signals, if they're actually distress calls, then our entire strategic approach to the region needs to be reconsidered. And if you're wrong, Thornton interjected, then we've wasted valuable time and resources chasing what amounts to a linguistic theory while actual threats develop unchecked. I understand the concern, sir, but the evidence suggests. The evidence, Hayes interrupted gently but firmly, has been reviewed by experienced intelligence analysts who understand the operational context. I think it's admirable that you're eager to contribute beyond your assigned role, but strategic analysis requires more than cultural knowledge. It requires operational experience and an understanding of how intelligence actually works in the field. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. Iris felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the frustration of knowing she was right but lacking the credibility to make anyone listen. Sir, I have field experience. My previous posting was in administrative support, according to your file, Hayes said, not unkindly. Look, Clark, no one doubts your intelligence or your work ethic. But there's a difference between understanding culture and understanding operational strategy. Perhaps it's best if you focus on the areas where you can make the most meaningful contribution. He turned back to the broader group, effectively ending the discussion. Now, let's move on to the resource allocation for the exercises. We need to finalize the reconnaissance rotation schedule. Iris sat down slowly, gathering her materials as the conversation moved forward without her. Around the table, officers returned to their notes and discussions, her presentation already forgotten. She noticed Captain Donovan lean toward a colleague and whisper something that prompted a brief smile. After the meeting, as people filed out of the room, Emma caught up with Iris in the hallway. Emma was a logistics coordinator, someone else who existed at the periphery of the center's operational hierarchy, and one of the few people who'd shown Iris genuine friendship. That was rough, Emma said quietly. For what it's worth, I thought your analysis was fascinating. Thank you, Iris replied, her voice flat despite her effort to sound normal. Hayes just has a very specific view of how things should work here. He doesn't respond well to people coloring outside the lines. I wasn't coloring outside the lines. I was trying to prevent a potentially catastrophic misreading of a dangerous situation. Emma nodded sympathetically but said nothing. What was there to say? The center's hierarchy was clear, and Iris had just been reminded, again, exactly where she stood in it. That afternoon, Iris returned to her small office and sat staring at her computer screen. The intercepted communications were still there, the distress signals still visible to anyone who knew how to read them. Somewhere in the Balkans, someone was in terrible danger, sending coded calls for help that were being systematically misinterpreted as political coordination. And Iris, who recognized what those signals actually meant, who had the training and experience to know she was reading them correctly, had just been dismissed as an overenthusiastic analyst who didn't understand how the real work got done. She opened the encrypted file again, the one with her personal analysis. She tracked the signals to a probable location, a compound in rural Serbia that official intelligence had identified as a nationalist meeting site. But if Iris was right, that compound wasn't hosting political coordination. It was holding a prisoner. The question was what to do about it. She'd tried the official channels and been shut down. She could try again, escalate further up the chain, but without credibility, she'd likely face the same dismissal, or worse. The center took a dim view of junior analysts who couldn't accept no for an answer. Iris's phone buzzed. A text from Hayes's assistant, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes requests meeting. His office, 1,600 hours. She stared at the message, wondering if this was about the morning's presentation. Perhaps Hayes wanted to discuss her focus again, to reinforce the boundaries of her role with more explicit instructions. At 1600, she knocked on Hayes's office door. Come in, Clark, he called. His office was significantly larger than hers, with windows overlooking the center's manicured grounds. Commendations and photographs lined the walls, documenting a distinguished career in military intelligence and strategic planning. Hayes gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit, please." Iris sat, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. "I wanted to follow up on this morning's session," Hayes began. "I hope you understand that my feedback was personal. I have great respect for your dedication to your work." "I understand, sir." "Good. Because I need you to understand something important about how we operate here. This center functions because everyone understands their role and stays within their area of expertise. When people start crossing into other departments' responsibilities, it creates confusion and inefficiency. Sir, I wasn't trying to undermine Major Thornton's work. I was simply... I know what you were trying to do, Clark. You were trying to prove that you're capable of more than cultural analysis. And perhaps you are. But that's not the point. The point is that we have a system, a hierarchy of expertise, that exists for good reasons. Strategic intelligence analysis requires specific training and operational experience that you simply don't have." Iris bit back her response, the truth that would complicate everything, that would force her to reveal aspects of her background that were meant to remain hidden. Instead, she nodded. "I want you to succeed here," Hayes continued, his tone softening slightly. "You're bright, hardworking, and well-liked. But you need to accept the limitations of your role. Focus on being the best cultural analyst you can be, and leave the strategic work to those trained for it. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Iris said quietly. "Good. Because I'd hate to see you damage your career here by developing a reputation as someone who doesn't respect boundaries." The meeting ended with Hayes's dismissal feeling less like guidance and more like a warning. As Iris walked back to her office, she understood with perfect clarity that she'd reached the limit of what official channels would allow. She tried to work within the system. She prepared thorough analysis, followed proper procedures, presented her findings through appropriate channels. And the system had responded by telling her to stay in her lane, to accept her limitations, to be content with the small space others had decided she should occupy. But somewhere in Serbia, someone was running out of time. Someone was sending distress signals that no one else was reading correctly. And Iris, who'd spent years in situations where she'd learned to trust her training over official wisdom, faced a choice that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She could do what Hayes wanted. She could focus on being a good cultural analyst, staying within boundaries, accepting that some fights weren't hers to engage in. Or she could do what she'd been trained to do in another life, when she'd learned that sometimes saving lives meant breaking rules and facing consequences that official channels would never forgive. That evening, Iris sat in her apartment and pulled out a locked case from the back of her closet. Inside were items from her previous life. Documents she wasn't supposed to have kept. Credentials that were supposed to have been surrendered. And a small velvet box containing 2 silver stars that represented a rank in a history that officially no longer existed. She held the stars in her palm, feeling their weight. These weren't decorative. They weren't symbolic. They represented 4 years of service in military intelligence, operating in some of the most dangerous regions in Eastern Europe, making decisions that had saved lives and occasionally cost them. Lieutenant Clark. That's who she'd been. That's who she still was, beneath the carefully constructed persona of the helpful analyst who smiled too much. She put the stars back in the box and made her decision. If official channels wouldn't listen, then she'd use unofficial ones. If the center wouldn't act on intelligence that could save a life, then she'd act independently. Tomorrow, she'd start planning an operation that everyone would say was impossible for someone like her. An operation that would either vindicate her completely or end her career in disgrace. But tonight, she allowed herself to remember who she really was. Not Cupcake. Not the decorative analyst who organized office parties. But Lieutenant Iris Clark, an intelligence officer who'd learned long ago that sometimes the only way to prove you're capable is to do the thing everyone says can't be done. The silver stars gleamed softly in the lamplight, silent witnesses to the choice she'd just made. The whispers intensified over the following week, spreading through the center like smoke through ventilation shafts. Iris first noticed the changed atmosphere during the morning briefing when she entered the conference room and conversation stopped mid-sentence. Ice tracked her movement to her usual seat in the back row, then quickly looked away when she met their gazes. "Did you hear about Clark's presentation?" she overheard Lieutenant Morrison saying to a colleague in the hallway later that day. Apparently she spent weeks building some elaborate alternative analysis that completely contradicted Thornton's intelligence assessment. "Weeks," the other officer replied. What was she thinking? She's a cultural analyst, not intelligence. Exactly. Hayes was apparently very diplomatic about it, but word is she basically implied that everyone else had gotten it wrong and only she understood what was really happening. Iris kept walking, her expression neutral, but the words stung more than she wanted to admit. The story was being rewritten with each retelling, her careful analysis transformed into arrogant overreach, her attempt to contribute into presumptuous interference. At lunch, she sat with Emma in the cafeteria, pushing food around her plate without much appetite. "They're saying I don't know my place," Iris said quietly. "That I'm trying to do work I'm not qualified for." Emma hesitated before responding. "Some people are saying that, yes. But there are others who think Hayes shut you down too quickly." "Which people?" "People who don't matter much in the hierarchy," Emma admitted. "Look, Iris, the problem isn't your analysis. The problem is that you made senior officers look bad. You suggested they'd missed something important, and people like Hayes don't respond well to that, especially from junior personnel." "Even if I'm right?" "Especially if you're right. That makes it worse." The real blow came during a conversation Iris wasn't meant to overhear. She'd stayed late working on routine reports, and most of the center had emptied out for the evening. Walking past Hayes's office on her way out, she heard voices through the partially open door. "The Clark situation is becoming problematic," Hayes was saying. "She's not accepting her role here." "Too ambitious for her own good," another voice replied. Iris recognized it as Major Thornton. "I've seen it before. Junior analysts who think they're smarter than everyone else, who can't accept that experience matters. It's more than ambition," Hayes continued. "There's something almost obsessive about it. The amount of time she's spending on analysis outside her assigned duties, the way she keeps pushing boundaries. It makes me question her judgment." "Do you think she's reliable?" Thornton asked. "I mean, for her actual job? Her work is technically proficient, but this fixation on intelligence matters she's not trained for suggests a concerning lack of awareness about her own limitations. Small people often overcompensate, try to prove themselves in areas where they're fundamentally unsuited." Small people. The words hit Iris like a physical blow. Not small in stature, though that was certainly part of it. Small in capability, in understanding, in worth. Small in every way that mattered in an institution that measured value in operational impact and strategic influence. She walked away from Hayes's office before she could hear more, her footsteps silent on the polished floor. Outside, the Brussels evening was cold and clear. She stood in the parking lot for a long moment, breathing deeply, trying to process what she'd just heard. They didn't doubt her analysis because it was wrong. They doubted it because she was small. Because she smiled too much. Because she existed in a role they decided was peripheral, and people in peripheral roles weren't supposed to see things that people in central roles missed. The worst part was understanding their logic. In their world, in their experience, the system worked. Intelligence analysts analyzed intelligence. Cultural specialists provided cultural context. Everyone stayed in their lane, and the system produced reliable results. Except when it didn't. Except when the system was fundamentally misreading a situation because everyone in the system shared the same blind spots and biases. Iris got into her car and sat in the darkness, staring at the illuminated windows of the center. Somewhere in those offices were intercepted communications that no one was reading correctly. Distress signals disguised as coordination messages. A life hanging in the balance while experienced professionals dismissed the one person who understood what was really happening. She could accept their assessment of her. She could internalize their doubts, believe that her obsessive preparation and boundary pushing meant something was wrong with her rather than something was wrong with their assumptions. Or she could trust her training, her instincts, and her analysis. She could accept that proving herself would mean doing something they'd consider impossible, something that would either vindicate her completely or destroy whatever remained of her credibility. She started her car and drove home through the quiet streets, already planning what came next. The whispered doubts would continue, would probably intensify. But doubts only mattered if you let them define your actions. And Iris had spent too many years in situations where listening to doubts meant people died. Iris's apartment was modest, a one-bedroom flat in a quiet Brussels neighborhood that suited her carefully constructed persona perfectly. Her colleagues, if they'd ever visited, would have found exactly what they expected, neat and organized, with books on European culture and language, a few tasteful decorative touches, nothing that suggested anything beyond the competent but unremarkable analyst they believed her to be. What they wouldn't have found was the locked storage unit 3 blocks away, rented under a slightly different name, where Iris kept the equipment and materials from her previous life. She visited the unit after midnight, when the streets were empty and the security cameras would show nothing more than a small woman in athletic clothes carrying a gym bag. Inside, she unlocked a metal cabinet that contained items carefully preserved from her years in military intelligence. Tactical communication equipment, encrypted and obsolete by current standards but still functional. Detailed maps of the Balkans marked with notes in a shorthand only she could read. Field gear that had seen actual use in operations she couldn't discuss even now. And in a separate sealed box, her service records, the real ones, documenting 4 years as a military intelligence officer specializing in Eastern European operations. For the past 3 months, since she'd first noticed the linguistic anomalies in the intercepted communications, Iris had been quietly preparing. Not hoping for a crisis, but knowing that if one came, she needed to be ready. She'd maintained her language skills, practicing Serbian and Albanian dialects in her apartment until the phrases flowed naturally. She'd studied current maps of the region, cross-referencing them with older surveys to identify changes in infrastructure and potential operational challenges. She'd monitored news from the Balkans obsessively, building a mental map of current conditions that went far beyond what official briefings provided. Most importantly, she'd maintained her network. The intelligence community was smaller than most people realized, and officers who'd served in difficult postings developed relationships that transcended official channels. Iris had worked with people who were now scattered across various agencies and positions, people who remembered her capabilities and who valued operational effectiveness over bureaucratic propriety. One of those contacts was a retired intelligence officer named David Chen, now working as a private security consultant in Vienna. They'd served together during a particularly dangerous operation in Kosovo, where Iris's linguistic skills and cultural knowledge had prevented what could have been a catastrophic diplomatic incident. She called him from a secured line at 0200 hours. "It's been a while," Chen said when he answered, his voice cautious but not unfriendly. "I assume this isn't a social call." "I need information," Iris replied. "Rural Serbia, about 60 kilometers south of Belgrade. There's a compound that's been flagged as a nationalist coordination site, but I think it's something else." "What kind of something else?" "A hostage situation. European intelligence officer, missing for 6 weeks, presumed dead. I think they're being held there, and I think the distress signals are being misread as political communications." There was a long pause. "That's a serious allegation. What's your confidence level?" 90%. "The linguistic patterns are unmistakable if you know what to look for." "And your current command knows about this assessment?" "They've dismissed it. I'm not operational anymore, remember? Just a cultural analyst who doesn't understand how real intelligence works." Chen made a sound that might have been a laugh or a grunt of disgust. "Let me make some inquiries." Quietly. "If you're right about this, there are people who need to know, official channels or not." Over the following days, Iris continued her preparation while maintaining her normal routine at the center. To her colleagues, she appeared to have accepted Hayes's guidance. She focused on her assigned cultural analysis work, attended meetings without offering controversial observations, and generally behaved like someone who'd learned to stay in her lane. But her evenings and weekends were dedicated to operational planning. She studied satellite imagery of the compound, identifying entry and exit points, security patterns, and potential complications. She reviewed extraction protocols, medical procedures for hostage situations, and contingency plans for dozens of scenarios. She also maintained her physical conditioning, a regime she'd never stopped but had kept carefully hidden from her center colleagues. Early morning runs before anyone else was awake. Strength training in her apartment where no one would see. The kind of fitness that went far beyond what a cultural analyst needed but exactly what an intelligence officer required. Chen called back after 5 days. "You were right. We've confirmed through back channels that there's a European officer missing, and the compound you identified has activity consistent with a holding situation rather than political coordination. Has anyone acted on this information? It's complicated. Officially, the officer is presumed dead. Mounting a rescue operation based on linguistic interpretation of intercepts would be difficult to authorize, especially across international borders. So they're going to let this person die because the paperwork is too complicated?" "I didn't say that. I said official authorization would be difficult. There are other options." "What kind of options?" "The kind we don't discuss on phone calls, even secured ones. But if someone were to provide actionable intelligence about the exact situation at that compound, there are people who would know what to do with it." Iris understood what he wasn't saying. Official channels moved slowly, bound by regulations and international protocols. Unofficial channels moved faster, operating in the gray spaces where lives mattered more than paperwork. "How would someone provide that intelligence?" she asked. "They'd need eyes on target. Direct observation, not satellite imagery or intercepted communications. Someone would need to get close enough to confirm the situation definitively. That's a solo reconnaissance operation in potentially hostile territory." "Yes," Chen agreed. "It would be extremely dangerous and almost certainly career-ending if it went wrong. It would require someone with language skills, cultural knowledge, operational training, and a willingness to risk everything to save someone they've never met." Iris stared at the maps spread across her apartment floor, at the equipment carefully maintained in her storage unit, at the person she'd become since leaving military intelligence and the person she'd been before. "Thank you for the information," she said. "Iris," Chen replied, his voice serious. "Think very carefully about this. You've built a good life in Brussels. Don't throw it away on a mission that might not succeed." "Noted," she said, and ended the call. She sat in the darkness of her apartment, knowing that she'd just crossed another threshold. The preparation phase was ending. The operational phase was about to begin. And when it did, there would be no going back to being the helpful analyst who organized office parties and accepted her limitations with a smile. The silver stars in her closet seemed to glow in her peripheral vision, reminding her of who she really was beneath all the careful camouflage. Not small. Not limited. Not someone who accepted that other people got to decide what she was capable of. Tomorrow, she'd begin the final phase of preparation. And soon after that, she'd prove to everyone at the center, especially to Hayes and his whispered doubts, exactly what their cupcake could accomplish when lives hung in the balance and rules became suggestions rather than restrictions. The change in atmosphere at the center was subtle at first, then increasingly unmistakable. Iris noticed it during a routine meeting when Hayes asked her to verify some cultural details about Serbian regional dialects. Her response, which drew on knowledge that went well beyond what a basic cultural analyst should possess, prompted a long look from the lieutenant colonel. "That's quite specific information," he said slowly. "Where did you acquire such detailed knowledge of Serbian security terminology?" "Academic research, sir," Iris replied smoothly. "I've been studying the region extensively to better support our work here." "Academic research," Hayes repeated, his tone suggesting he didn't entirely believe her. "That must be very time-consuming." "I take my responsibilities seriously, sir." After the meeting, she overheard Hayes speaking with Major Thornton in the hallway. There's something off about Clark's background. Her cultural knowledge is far too detailed for someone with her listed experience. Maybe she's just a dedicated student, Thornton suggested. Or maybe there's more to her personnel file than what we're seeing. I'm going to request a deeper background review. Iris felt ice settle in her stomach. A deeper background review would reveal inconsistencies, gaps in her employment history that were classified but would still raise questions. The cover story that had seemed adequate when she'd been just a peripheral cultural analyst would not withstand serious scrutiny. Over the following week, she noticed other changes. Her security access to certain databases was quietly restricted. Her requests for specific intelligence reports began taking longer to process. During meetings, officers would sometimes stop talking when she approached, conversations cutting off mid-sentence. Captain Donovan confronted her directly one afternoon near the coffee station. "People are wondering about you, Clark. About why you're so interested in operational intelligence. About where you're getting information that's not in the official briefings." "I read extensively," Iris replied. "Is that a problem?" "It is when you're reading things that make people question your intentions. There's dedicated, and then there's obsessive. You're starting to look like the latter. I'm trying to do my job well. Your job is cultural analysis, not intelligence collection. The fact that you don't seem to understand the difference is what's making people nervous." The surveillance became more obvious. Iris noticed the same security officer appearing near her workspace multiple times per day. Her computer login times were being monitored. She received a query from IT about her access patterns. Someone had gone through her desk during her lunch break, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice but obvious to someone trained to spot such intrusions. Emma pulled her aside one evening as they were leaving the building. "Iris, people are talking. There are questions about whether you're reliable, whether you might be sharing information inappropriately. That's absurd. Is it? You've been pushing boundaries constantly. You presented analysis that contradicted senior intelligence assessments. You ask questions about things outside your clearance level. You disappear for hours at a time without explanation. I take walks. I need to clear my head. Do you?" Emma asked pointedly. "Because someone reported seeing you near the communications center last week after hours." "What were you doing there?" Iris had been checking the latest intercepts from the Serbian compound, monitoring the distress signals that were growing increasingly desperate. But she couldn't explain that without revealing too much. "I was working late and took a wrong turn," she said. "The building is confusing at night." Emma's expression suggested she didn't entirely believe the explanation. "Be careful, Iris. Whatever you're doing, whatever you think you're accomplishing, it's making you look suspicious. And in this environment, suspicion can destroy a career." The breaking point came during a security briefing 3 days later. Hayes stood at the front of the room, his expression serious as he addressed the assembled personnel. "I want to remind everyone about the importance of operational security. We've had concerns recently about information discipline, about personnel accessing materials outside their need-to-know parameters. This center functions on trust, and that trust requires everyone to respect boundaries and protocols." His eyes found Iris in the crowd, holding her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. The message was clear and public. She was being identified as a security concern without being named directly, her behavior characterized as a potential threat to the center's operations. After the briefing, Hayes called her to his office again. This time, there was no pretense of mentorship or guidance. His expression was cold, professional, the look of a commander addressing a problem that needed to be resolved. "Clark, I'm going to be direct. Your behavior over the past several weeks has raised serious concerns. The excessive interest in operational matters, the access to materials beyond your assignment, the questions you've been asking. It's creating a perception that you may not be suitable for your current position." "Sir, I've done nothing improper. My work has been exemplary. Your work within your assigned role has been adequate. It's everything else that's problematic. I'm placing formal restrictions on your access. You're limited to cultural analysis materials only, no intelligence briefings, no operational reports. You'll submit a daily log of your activities to your supervisor. And you're prohibited from accessing secure areas without explicit authorization. You're essentially putting me under surveillance. I'm protecting the operational security of this center. If you have nothing to hide, these restrictions shouldn't be a problem. Iris left the office feeling trapped. The system had identified her as a threat, not because she'd done anything wrong but because she refused to accept the limitations others had placed on her. Her preparation, her dedication, her refusal to be content with a peripheral role had all been reinterpreted as evidence of suspicious intent. That evening, she sat in her apartment and reviewed her options. The surveillance meant she'd have to be even more careful with her preparation. The access restrictions meant she'd lost her ability to monitor the situation in Serbia through official channels. And the formal documentation of concerns about her reliability meant that any unconventional action she took would be immediately suspect. But the distress signals from the compound were still there, still desperate, still being ignored by everyone except her. And she was running out of time to do anything about it. Chin called again that night. I'm hearing things through back channels. Your command has flagged you as a potential security risk. I'm aware. This is going to make everything harder, Iris. If you're planning what I think you're planning, you need to understand that you'll have no institutional support. If things go wrong, you'll be completely on your own. I've been on my own before. Not like this. This time you're not just operating independently. You're operating against your own command structure. That's a different kind of exposure. Iris looked at the silver stars in their velvet box, thinking about the officer they represented. That officer had made hard choices in difficult circumstances. That officer had understood that sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting consequences that ended careers. I understand the risks, she said quietly. But someone's life is at stake, and I'm the only one who seems to care about saving it. Then be smart about it. Whatever you're planning, make sure you're ready. Because once you start, there won't be any coming back. After the call ended, Iris began the final phase of her preparation. She'd been identified as suspicious, placed under restrictions, essentially marked as untrustworthy. The system had decided she was a problem. She was about to prove them right in ways they couldn't imagine. The summons came on a gray Thursday morning that felt heavy with inevitability. Iris was reviewing routine cultural reports when her computer screen flashed with a high-priority message: report to Lieutenant Colonel Hayes' office immediately. Bring your security credentials and building access cards. She knew what this meant. The restrictions from the previous week had been preliminary. This was something more serious, more final. Hayes wasn't alone when she arrived. Commander Patricia Ashford from the Internal Security Division sat beside him, her expression professionally neutral but her presence sending an unmistakable message. This wasn't a mentorship conversation or even a reprimand. This was an investigation. Sit down, Clark, Hayes said, his voice carrying none of its usual careful diplomacy. Iris sat, her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing through possible scenarios and appropriate responses. Ashford opened a file, her movements deliberate. Specialist Clark, we've conducted a review of your activities over the past several months. The findings are concerning. What findings specifically? Iris asked, keeping her voice steady. Unauthorized access to intelligence databases on 47 occasions. Requests for information outside your clearance level. Extended time in secure areas without documented purpose. And perhaps most troubling, evidence that you've been conducting independent analysis of classified materials and potentially sharing that analysis through unauthorized channels. I've shared nothing inappropriately. My analysis has been. Your analysis, Hayes interrupted, has been unauthorized and potentially dangerous. You presented alternative intelligence assessments that contradicted official findings. You've questioned the competence of senior officers. You've acted as if you possess expertise and authority that you simply don't have. Sir, if you'd actually review my analysis, you'd see. We've reviewed it, Ashford cut in sharply. What we see is a junior analyst with an inflated sense of her own capabilities, someone who can't accept her role within the organizational structure. More concerning, we see someone who appears to be conducting activities that suggest intentions we cannot verify. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Iris felt her anger building but forced it down. Emotion would only confirm their narrative that she was unstable, unreliable, unsuited for her position. "What are you suggesting?" she asked quietly. Hayes leaned forward. "Clark, I'm going to ask you directly. What exactly have you been doing? The late hours, the excessive research, the contacts outside official channels. We need to understand what's happening here. I've been trying to do my job. To understand the region I'm supposed to be analyzing." "No," Ashford said flatly. "What you've been doing goes far beyond cultural analysis. You've been operating as if you're still in your previous position." The room went silent. Iris felt something cold settle in her chest. "My previous position was administrative support," she said carefully. "Was it?" Ashford opened another file. "Because we've found some interesting gaps in your employment history. Periods where your location can't be verified. References to positions that don't appear in standard databases. Training that seems far more extensive than what an administrative support role would require." They'd been digging, going deeper than the surface background check. Not deep enough to find the classified truth, but deep enough to know something didn't add up. "I'm not at liberty to discuss certain aspects of my previous service," Iris said, choosing her words carefully. "Some positions involve classified elements that remain restricted." "Then perhaps," Hayes said, his voice hard, "you should contact whoever classified those elements and get clearance to explain them. Because right now, what we have is a junior analyst with a mysteriously opaque background engaging in suspicious activities that suggest either unauthorized intelligence gathering or something worse." "Something worse?" Iris repeated, her anger finally breaking through. "You think I'm a security threat? After 18 months of exemplary service?" "I think you're someone who doesn't respect boundaries," Hayes replied. "Someone who believes the rules don't apply to her. Someone who's shown increasingly erratic judgment." Ashford closed her files with a decisive snap. "Effective immediately, Specialist Clark, you're being placed on administrative leave pending a full security review. You'll surrender your credentials and building access. You're prohibited from entering center facilities or accessing any center systems until the review is complete. You're suspending me. We're protecting the integrity of this center's operations," Hayes said. "If the review clears you, you'll be reinstated. If it doesn't, well, then we'll discuss your future here." Iris stood slowly, removing her security badge and access cards from their lanyard. She placed them on Hayes's desk with careful precision, each movement controlled despite the fury building inside her. "This is wrong," she said quietly. "There's someone in danger, someone sending distress signals that you're all misreading, and you're too focused on protecting your organizational hierarchy to see it." "That's exactly the kind of grandiose thinking that concerns us," Ashford replied. "You're not saving anyone, Clark. You're a cultural analyst who's convinced herself she's something more important. That kind of delusion is dangerous." Iris looked at Hayes, at the man who'd dismissed her analysis, who'd called her cupcake behind her back, who'd spent months systematically limiting her ability to contribute meaningfully. "When this situation escalates," she said, "when the person you're ignoring dies because you refuse to listen, I hope you remember this conversation." "That sounds like a threat," Hayes said coldly. "It's a prediction. Based on analysis you've decided isn't worth considering because it comes from someone you've decided isn't worth respecting." She walked out of the office, down the hallway past colleagues who avoided eye contact, through the lobby where security personnel watched her departure with expressions that suggested they'd been briefed on her new status as a potential threat. Outside, the Brussels afternoon was cold and gray. Iris stood on the center's steps, officially suspended, under investigation, her career likely over regardless of what the security review found. She'd tried to work within the system. She'd followed procedures, presented evidence, made her case through official channels. and the system had responded by treating her dedication as suspicious, her competence as threatening, her refusal to accept limitations as evidence of instability. They'd taken away her credentials, her access, her official authority. But they couldn't take away her training, her skills, or her certainty that she was right about the situation in Serbia. Iris walked to her car and sat in the driver's seat, staring at the center's imposing facade. Inside those walls, people were making decisions based on flawed intelligence. Someone was going to die because the system couldn't accept that a small, smiling cultural analyst might understand something that experienced intelligence officers had missed. She pulled out her phone and sent a single encrypted message to Chen, "I'm moving forward. No more delays." His response came within minutes, "Understood. Be careful." And Iris? Make it count. She started her car and drove away from the center, from the career she'd built, from the carefully constructed life that had just collapsed around her. But as she drove through the Brussels streets, Iris felt something unexpected. Not despair or fear, but clarity. They'd tried to suppress her, to push her back into the narrow box they'd decided she belonged in. They'd failed to understand that some people couldn't be contained by other people's expectations, that some decisions couldn't be controlled by organizational hierarchies. Tonight, she'd finalize her preparation. Tomorrow, she'd prove to everyone at the center, especially to Hayes and his carefully documented concerns, that the woman they'd dismissed as obsessive and delusional was actually the only person who'd understood what was really at stake. The suspension had freed her from the last restraints of official channels. Now she could do what needed to be done without worrying about institutional consequences. After all, they'd already decided her career was over. She might as well make sure it ended with saving a life rather than accepting defeat. The emergency alert came through Chen's network at 0342 hours on a Saturday morning. Iris was already awake, had been for hours, reviewing maps and equipment in her apartment when her secured phone buzzed with the encrypted message. Signal degradation detected. Subject vitals critical. Estimate 48 to 72 hours maximum window. The distress signals from the Serbian compound had changed. What had been coded calls for help were now medical emergencies barely disguised in the intercepted communications. Someone was dying, and the timeline had just collapsed from uncertain to immediate. Iris called Chen immediately. "I saw the alert. Do we have confirmation?" Independent medical analysis of the communication patterns suggests severe deterioration. Whatever's happening there, it's reaching a critical point. If we're going to act, it has to be now. Has anyone at the center seen this analysis? They've seen it. Major Thornton dismissed it as speculation based on insufficient data. Hayes concurred. They're maintaining their position that the compound is a nationalist coordination site and that any intervention would be premature and potentially provocative. Iris felt rage burning through her exhaustion. Someone is dying right now, and they're worried about being provocative? They're worried about being wrong, Chen corrected. About committing resources to a rescue operation based on linguistic interpretation that contradicts their official intelligence. If they act and you're mistaken, it's a career-ending diplomatic incident. If they don't act and you're right, well, they can claim they followed proper protocols. So they're going to let someone die to protect their careers. Welcome to institutional decision-making. Look, I've got a team ready to move if we can provide definitive confirmation of the situation. But they need more than intercept analysis. They need eyes on target, someone who can verify that there's actually a hostage situation before they cross international borders for an unauthorized extraction. That's a solo reconnaissance operation in potentially hostile territory. Yes. It would require someone with language skills, operational training, and cultural knowledge. Someone who could get close to the compound, assess the situation, and exfiltrate with actionable intelligence. It would be extremely dangerous, almost certainly illegal, and definitely career-ending if discovered. Iris looked at the maps spread across her apartment floor, at the equipment she'd been maintaining for months, at the silver stars that represented who she really was beneath all the careful camouflage. How long do I have to decide? Based on the medical analysis? maybe 24 hours before the window closes completely. After that, even if we confirm the situation, an extraction might be too late. After the call ended, Iris sat in the darkness of her apartment and faced the decision she'd been avoiding since the first moment she'd recognized the distress signals. She could walk away, except that she'd tried and failed. That institutional resistance was too powerful to overcome. She'd already lost her career, already been marked as unstable and unreliable. Further action would only dig that hole deeper. Or she could do what her training had taught her, what 4 years of military intelligence operations had proven she was capable of. She could trust her analysis, her skills, and her judgment over the collective doubt of people who'd decided she was too small, too peripheral, too insignificant to understand things they'd missed. She opened her laptop and began drafting a detailed operations plan. Route to Serbia, approach to the compound, reconnaissance protocol, exfiltration plan, emergency contingencies. The kind of thorough preparation that had kept her alive in previous operations and that would either vindicate her completely or confirm every suspicious assessment Hayes had documented. At 0800 hours, she received another encrypted message, this time from an unknown number. The text was brief: sender has requested international cooperation to monitor the compound. Official action timeline, 6 to 8 weeks pending diplomatic coordination. Thought you should know. 6 to 8 weeks. The person in that compound had perhaps 72 hours, and official channels were planning an operation that would take 2 months to authorize. Iris made her decision. She'd spent 18 months being told she didn't understand how real intelligence work operated, that her role was to provide cultural context and lead strategic decisions to experienced professionals. Those experienced professionals were now choosing bureaucratic safety over human life. She began packing her operational gear, pulling items from the storage unit and organizing them with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this before. Tactical clothing that would let her blend into the rural Serbian environment. Communication equipment for maintaining contact with Chen's network. Medical supplies in case the situation was worse than anticipated. And a go bag with emergency currency, backup identification, and extraction resources. By noon, she was ready. She sent Chen a simple message: moving to operational phase. Will provide confirmation within 48 hours. His response was equally brief: extraction team standing by. Don't die proving a point. Iris smiled grimly at that. She wasn't trying to prove a point. She was trying to save a life. The fact that doing so would also prove to Hayes and everyone at the center that they'd fundamentally misunderstood both the situation and her capabilities was just a bonus. She took one last look around her apartment, at the life she'd built as a cultural analyst, at the comfortable routine that had felt increasingly like a cage. Then she picked up her gear and walked out the door. By evening, she was on a train heading southeast toward Serbia, watching the European countryside roll past and reviewing her operational plan one final time. Somewhere ahead, in a compound that official intelligence had dismissed as a political coordination site, someone was sending desperate signals that only she seemed able to read correctly. The crisis moment had arrived. Official channels had chosen an action. Iris had chosen something different, rather than an intelligence officer on an unauthorized reconnaissance mission. The drive to the target area took 3 hours through increasingly rural terrain. She passed through small villages where old men sat outside cafes watching traffic with suspicious eyes, where the modern European Union felt distant and the older Balkans' rhythms still dominated daily life. 20 kilometers from the compound, Iris pulled off the main road and hiked to an observation position she'd identified from satellite imagery. The ridge offered clear sightlines to the target while remaining concealed in dense vegetation. She set up her equipment and began systematic surveillance. The compound matched the intelligence reports. Old farm buildings partially renovated, surrounded by newer security fencing that seemed excessive for agricultural use. 2 vehicles parked outside, both showing signs of regular use. And subtle indicators that someone was trying very hard to look like they weren't trying to hide anything. Through her optical equipment, Iris observed patterns that confirmed her analysis. guard rotations that were too disciplined for a casual political meeting site, communication equipment that was too sophisticated for rural farmers, and most tellingly, medical waste being burned in a barrel behind the main building. Someone inside was receiving treatment for injuries or illness. She spent 6 hours documenting everything, building a comprehensive picture of the compound's operations. As evening approached, she moved closer, using approaching darkness as cover to reach a position where she could attempt direct audio surveillance. That's when she heard it. A voice speaking in English with a distinct accent, barely audible through the compound's windows. "Please, need medical attention, anyone receiving." The distress signal. Not coded in intercepted communications, but actual verbal cries for help from someone who'd been in prison long enough to grow desperate. Iris recorded the audio, documented the medical waste, photographed the security setup, and compiled everything into a comprehensive intelligence package. She had definitive confirmation. The compound was holding a prisoner who needed immediate medical intervention. She retreated to her vehicle and encrypted the intelligence package for transmission to Chen's network. Her finger hovered over the send button as she faced the impossible choice she'd been avoiding. If she sent the intelligence, she'd trigger an unauthorized extraction operation across international borders. Lives would be at risk, diplomatic incidents would occur, and she'd be directly responsible for an action that violated every official protocol. Her career wouldn't just be over, she might face criminal charges. If she didn't send it, she'd be choosing to let someone die while she possessed the information that could save them. She'd have confirmation that her analysis had been correct all along, that Hayes and the sender had been catastrophically wrong, but that vindication would be worthless if the person she'd been trying to save was dead. Iris thought about the 18 months she'd spent being dismissed as too small, too peripheral, too insignificant to understand strategic intelligence. She thought about Hayes calling her Cupcake, about the whispered doubts and systematic suppression, about being suspended and investigated for refusing to accept limitations that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities. She thought about the lieutenant she'd been before, the intelligence officer who'd made hard decisions in impossible situations and had learned that sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting consequences that ended careers. Her phone buzzed. A message from Chen, window closing fast. Need your confirmation to proceed. Below that, another message, this one from an unknown number but clearly from someone at the center monitoring her communications. Clark, if you're reading this, stand down. Whatever you're planning, it's not worth destroying your life. Return to Brussels and we can work through this properly. They knew. Somehow they'd figured out what she was doing, were monitoring her movements or communications despite her precautions. The message was probably from Hayes, trying to prevent her from taking action that would embarrass the center and confirm that their dismissal of her analysis had been wrong. Stand down. Return to Brussels. Except that institutional resistance was too powerful, that one person couldn't override the collective judgment of experienced professionals, that knowing you were right wasn't enough when the system decided you were wrong. Iris looked at the intelligence package on her screen, at the audio recording of someone crying for help, at the documented evidence that would prove everything she'd been saying for months. She pressed send. The message went out through encrypted channels to Chen's network, triggering a response that would bring an extraction team across the border within hours. An unauthorized operation that would either save a life or create an international incident that would destroy multiple careers. Her phone immediately erupted with incoming calls. The sender, trying to reach her, trying to order her to stand down and abort whatever she'd set in motion. Iris turned off the phone and began her exfiltration, moving quickly through the darkness toward her extraction point. She'd made her choice. Not the safe choice, not the career-preserving choice, but the only choice that aligned with who she really was beneath all the careful camouflage. Behind her, in the compound, someone was waiting for rescue. Ahead of her, consequences were accumulating that would transform her life completely. But in this moment, driving through the Serbian night toward an uncertain future, Iris felt something she hadn't experienced in 18 months. She felt like herself again. Not Cupcake, not the dismissed analyst, but Lieutenant Iris Clark, someone who understood that sometimes the impossible choice was the only real choice available. the extraction team would arrive in approximately 4 hours. By dawn, they'd either confirm her analysis and save a life, or prove that everyone at the center had been right to doubt her judgment. Iris pressed harder on the accelerator, racing toward whatever came next, knowing she'd never be able to return to the comfortable life she'd left behind, but somehow feeling more alive than she had in months. The extraction team crossed into Serbia at 0230 hours, a 6-person unit led by a former special operations officer named Viktor Petrov, whom Chin had worked with for years. Iris met them at the designated rally point 15 kilometers from the target compound, an abandoned farm building that provided cover and space for final mission planning. "You're the analyst?" Petrov asked when Iris approached, his tone suggesting skepticism about her presence. "I'm the intelligence officer who confirmed the target," Iris replied, her voice carrying an authority that made Petrov reassess his initial impression. She spread her reconnaissance materials across a makeshift table, walking the team through everything she'd documented. Guard patterns, building layouts, security vulnerabilities, and most critically, the exact location where the prisoner was being held. "Medical condition of the target?" Petrov asked. "Critical. Based on the audio I captured and the medical waste patterns, I estimate they have perhaps 48 hours without intervention. The distress signals have been consistent for weeks, but the recent degradation suggests rapid deterioration." One of Petrov's team members, a medic named Anna, reviewed Iris's documentation carefully. "This is excellent intelligence. Detailed, current, and operationally relevant. Where did you train?" "That's classified," Iris said simply. Petrov nodded, accepting the answer. In this world, people's backgrounds were often complicated and rarely fully disclosed. What mattered was competence, and Iris's reconnaissance work demonstrated professional-level capability. "The approach route," Iris continued, pointing to her marked map. "We come in from the northeast, using this tree line for cover. Guard rotation puts minimum personnel on the north side between 0400 and 0500 hours. That's our window." "You're not coming with us," Petrov stated. "Your part was intelligence gathering. We handle the extraction." "I'm coming," Iris replied firmly. "The prisoner may be injured or disoriented. If they're European intelligence, they'll be trained to resist extraction by unknown personnel. You'll need someone who can communicate effectively, someone who understands their operational background. You're an analyst, not an operator." Iris met his eyes steadily. "I'm an intelligence officer with 4 years of field experience in this region. I know the language, the culture, and the protocols. You need me on this." Petrov studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You stay back during the breach. Once we secure the target, you come in for communication. Any shooting starts, you hit the ground and stay there. Clear?" "Clear." They moved out at 0345 hours, 6 operators and 1 intelligence officer approaching the compound through darkness that was just beginning to fade toward dawn. Iris stayed in her assigned position, third in the formation, moving with practiced silence through terrain she'd memorized from her reconnaissance. The compound was quiet, light showing in only one building. Through her night vision equipment, Iris could see the guard she'd documented, walking his predictable pattern with the kind of casual inattention that comes from weeks of uneventful routine. Petrov's team moved with professional precision. 2 operators neutralized the guard silently, securing him with zip ties and a gag. Another pair breached the building's door while Anna and the remaining operator secured the perimeter. Iris followed the breach team inside, moving quickly through rooms that smelled of damp concrete and human despair. They found the prisoner in a locked interior room, exactly where Iris's analysis had predicted. A woman in her 30s, European features, showing signs of extended captivity and physical trauma. She was conscious but clearly deteriorating, her breathing labored and her eyes unfocused. "British intelligence," Anna confirmed after a quick medical assessment. "Multiple injuries, dehydration, possible internal trauma. We need to move her now." The prisoner's eyes focused on Iris as she approached. Who are you?" Iris switched to English, keeping her voice calm and professional. Lieutenant Iris Clark, European Defense Analysis Center. We received your distress signals. We're extracting you to medical facilities. The signals, someone actually read them correctly? Someone did. Now we need to get you out of here. The extraction took 12 minutes, the team moving with controlled urgency as they transferred the prisoner to their vehicle. Behind them, the compound's remaining occupants were just beginning to realize something had gone wrong, shouts echoing in the early morning air. By the time organized pursuit could be mounted, Petrov's team was kilometers away, racing toward the border with their rescued intelligence officer receiving emergency medical treatment in the back of their vehicle. Iris sat beside the prisoner, monitoring her condition and maintaining communication with Chen's network. Package secured. Target condition critical but stable. ETA to medical facilities 45 minutes. The prisoner gripped Iris's hand weakly. How did you know? How did you read the signals when no one else did? Because I'd been where you were, Iris replied quietly. I knew what it felt like to send calls for help that no one seemed to hear. I wasn't going to let that happen to someone else. As they crossed back into friendly territory and handed the prisoner over to a waiting medical team, Petrov approached Iris with an expression of professional respect. That was exceptional work. The intelligence, the operational planning, the execution. Whatever your official role is, you're wasted as an analyst. I was an intelligence officer, Iris said. Then I became a cultural analyst because that's where they assigned me. Now I'm probably unemployed and facing criminal charges. Worth it? Iris watched as the medical team loaded the rescued intelligence officer into an ambulance, saw the woman who'd been sending desperate signals for weeks finally receiving the help she'd needed. Yes, she said simply. Completely worth it. Her phone, which she'd turned back on during the extraction, erupted with incoming messages. Dozens of calls from the center, from Hayes, from security personnel demanding she report her location and activities immediately. There was also one message from Chen, target extraction successful. Patient stable and receiving treatment. British intelligence confirmed identity and expressed official gratitude. Well done, Lieutenant. Iris smiled at that last word. Not analyst, not specialist, but lieutenant. The rank she'd earned and the identity she tried to set aside when she'd accepted the cultural analysis position. The unauthorized mission was complete. The impossible task that everyone at the center had said couldn't be done, that they'd dismissed as the grandiose delusion of an overconfident analyst, had succeeded perfectly. Now came the reckoning. Hayes and the center would have to explain why they'd ignored intelligence that proved accurate, why they'd suspended the officer who'd been right all along, why their entire assessment of the situation had been catastrophically wrong. And Iris would have to explain why she'd conducted an unauthorized operation across international borders, why she'd ignored direct orders to stand down, why she'd risked everything to save someone she'd never met. She looked forward to that explanation. Because this time, she wouldn't be speaking as the diminished analyst they'd tried to suppress. She'd be speaking as Lieutenant Clark, an intelligence officer who'd just proven exactly what someone they'd called Cupcake was actually capable of accomplishing. The silver stars in her pocket felt heavier now, weighted with vindication and consequence in equal measure. But as she climbed into Chen's vehicle for the drive back to Brussels, Iris felt no regret. Some missions were worth every risk, every consequence, every sacrifice. This had been one of them. The emergency session convened at 0800 hours in the center's main conference room. Every senior officer was present, along with representatives from NATO Command and the European Intelligence Directorate. Iris stood at the front of the room, no longer in civilian clothes but in a pressed uniform that carried insignia most of the assembled officers had never seen her wear. Hayes sat near the front, his face pale, his expression cycling between shock and something that might have been grudging respect. Beside him, Commander Ashford reviewed documents with the intensity of someone trying to understand how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong in her assessment. General Laurent Fischer from NATO Command spoke first, his German accent precise and authoritative. Let me ensure I understand the timeline correctly. Specialist Clark, while under administrative suspension and investigation, conducted an unauthorized solo reconnaissance operation into Serbian territory, confirmed the presence of a hostage, and provided actionable intelligence that enabled a successful extraction operation that saved the life of a European intelligence officer presumed dead? Yes, sir, Iris replied, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. And during this operation, you utilized training and skills from your previous service as a military intelligence officer, a background that was classified and therefore not available to your command here? Yes, sir. My previous service was compartmentalized due to the sensitive nature of the operations. When I transferred to the center, I was instructed to present a simplified service record. Fisher turned to Hayes. Lieutenant Colonel, you suspended this officer for behavior you characterized as suspicious and erratic. Based on what we now know about her actual background and capabilities, do you wish to revise that assessment? Hayes stood slowly, and for a moment, Iris saw genuine conflict in his expression. Sir, with respect, my assessment was based on the information available to me at the time. Specialist Clark's actual service record explains her capabilities but doesn't excuse her unauthorized actions. Doesn't it? Fisher's tone was sharp. You dismissed her intelligence analysis. You restricted her access. You essentially pushed her into a position where the only way to save a life was to operate outside official channels. One might argue that you created the exact situation you then criticized her for. General, I was protecting operational security. You were protecting your assumption that a junior analyst couldn't possibly understand something that senior officers had missed, Fisher interrupted. An assumption that nearly cost a European intelligence officer their life. He turned back to Iris. Lieutenant Clark, and yes, I'm using your actual rank, your actions were unauthorized, dangerous, and completely contrary to protocol. They were also extraordinarily brave and ultimately successful. This presents command with a unique situation. Iris remained silent, waiting. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared herself for either vindication or court-martial. After consultation with the Intelligence Directorate and NATO Command, Fisher continued, we've determined that your capabilities have been significantly underutilized in your current assignment. Effective immediately, you're being transferred to the European Special Operations Intelligence Group. Your rank will be reinstated, and you'll be assigned to operations that actually match your training and experience. The room erupted in murmurs. Hayes looked as if he'd been struck. Ashford's expression suggested she was rapidly recalculating everything she'd concluded about Iris during the investigation. Additionally, Fisher said, raising his voice over the noise, Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, you'll be conducting a comprehensive review of personnel assessment procedures at this center. Clearly, there are gaps in how we identify and utilize talent. Consider this your opportunity to ensure we don't make similar mistakes in the future. Hayes's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Yes, sir. Fisher gestured to Iris. Lieutenant, you're dismissed. Report to the Special Operations Group headquarters in Stuttgart on Monday. I believe you've earned a few days of rest before starting your new assignment. As Iris walked toward the door, Hayes stood and moved to intercept her. They faced each other in the hallway, the weight of the past months hanging between them. I underestimated you, Hayes said quietly. I let my assumptions about who you were prevent me from seeing your actual capabilities. That's on me. Yes, sir, it is, Iris replied without hostility. But you weren't entirely wrong. I did push boundaries. I did operate outside my assigned role. The difference is that I was right. The ends justify the means? The ends were a saved life. I'll let you decide if that justifies anything. Hayes studied her for a long moment. For what it's worth, Clark, Lieutenant Clark, I hope you succeed in your new assignment. You've certainly earned the opportunity. Iris nodded and continued down the hallway, past colleagues who now looked at her with expressions ranging from awe to embarrassment. Emma caught up with her near the exit. I don't even know what to say, Emma said. Military intelligence officer? Special operations? You've been holding out on us. I was holding out on everyone, including myself, Iris replied. Trying to be someone smaller, quieter, more acceptable. Turns out that doesn't work well for me. Apparently not, Emma laughed. So, Cupcake, huh? I heard that's what Hayes called you. Iris smiled. He did. Turns out cupcakes are tougher than they look. 6 months later, Iris stood in a briefing room in Stuttgart, addressing a team of intelligence officers from across Europe. The silver stars on her uniform caught the light as she moved, no longer hidden in a velvet box but worn openly, earned and recognized. The operation in Serbia taught us several important lessons, she was saying, clicking through slides that showed the compound, the extraction, the successful rescue. First, that intelligence analysis requires diverse perspectives. What looks like coordination to one analyst might look like distress signals to another. We need to value those different interpretations rather than dismissing them. In the audience, she spotted several familiar faces. Captain Donovan, who'd transferred to the Special Operations Group 3 months after her reassignment. Major Thornton, attending as a liaison from the Analysis Center. Even Hayes, present for a joint operations coordination meeting. After the briefing, Thornton approached her. That was impressive, Lieutenant. Your methodology for linguistic analysis has been adopted across several NATO intelligence centers. You've essentially changed how we approach intercept interpretation. I'm glad it's making a difference, Iris replied. More than you know. We've identified 3 other potential hostage situations that were being misread as coordination activities. Your framework saved those investigations from going down the wrong path. Hayes joined them, his expression less certain than Thornton's. Lieutenant Clark, I wanted to update you on changes at the center. We've implemented new assessment procedures that specifically look for unconventional skills and backgrounds. We're also encouraging analysts to challenge senior assessments when they have strong evidence. That's good to hear, sir. It's because of what happened with you. The center needed that wake-up call, even if it was uncomfortable to receive it. He paused, then added quietly, I've recommended Emma for advanced training. She has capabilities we weren't utilizing effectively. I'm trying not to make the same mistake twice. After they left, Iris returned to her office, a space significantly larger than her former closet at the Analysis Center. Her walls were covered with operational maps, intelligence summaries, and photographs from successful missions. In one corner, almost hidden, was the old photograph from her previous intelligence service, the one that had hung behind a filing cabinet in Brussels. Her phone buzzed with a message from Chen, saw your briefing made it into the NATO intelligence review. Not bad for someone who used to be called Cupcake. How does it feel to be officially impressive? She smiled and typed back, the same as it felt when I was unofficially impressive. Except now people listen. That evening, as Iris prepared to leave for the day, she received an unexpected visitor. A young lieutenant named Sarah, recently assigned to the Special Operations Group, knocked hesitantly on her door frame. Ma'am, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm starting an intelligence analysis next week, and I heard about your background. About how you were working in a position that didn't match your capabilities, and how you proved yourself. Come in, Iris said, gesturing to a chair. Sarah sat, looking nervous. I'm in a similar situation. I have operational experience that's not reflected in my current assignment. I've been trying to contribute more, but I keep getting told to stay in my lane. I was wondering if you had any advice. Iris looked at the young officer, seeing echoes of her own frustration and determination. The advice depends on whether you want the safe answer or the honest one. The honest one, please. Then here it is, know your capabilities. Prepare obsessively. Document everything. And when the moment comes that requires what you know, don't wait for permission to do what's right. Be ready to face consequences, because they will come. But also be ready to prove that you were right to trust yourself over other people's limitations. That's not exactly standard career advice, Sarah said with a slight smile. No, it's not. Standard career advice would have left someone dead in a Serbian compound while I stayed quietly in my lane. Sometimes you have to decide what matters more, your career trajectory or the impact you can make. Sarah stood to leave, then turned back. They call you the officer who changed everything. Is that how you see yourself? Iris thought about the question carefully. I see myself as someone who refused to be smaller than she actually was. The changes that came from that weren't about me. They were about institutions learning that talent doesn't always look like what they expect it to look like. After Sarah left, Iris walked through the Special Operations Group headquarters, past busy offices and briefing rooms where officers planned operations that would never be discussed publicly. This was where she belonged, where her capabilities were valued rather than suppressed, where being exceptional was expected rather than suspicious. She thought about Hayes and his condescending nickname, about the months of being dismissed and underestimated, about the night she'd climbed into Serbian territory knowing her career was likely over regardless of whether she succeeded. The silver stars on her uniform represented more than rank. They represented the truth that had always existed beneath the surface, that determination and capability couldn't be suppressed indefinitely, that systems built on assumptions about who deserved opportunities would eventually face people who refused to accept those assumptions. As Iris walked to her car in the fading Stuttgart daylight, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Not because she'd been vindicated, though she had been. Not because her career had been rescued, though it had been transformed into something far better than what she'd lost. But because somewhere in Europe, an intelligence officer was alive because she'd refused to let other people's doubts define what she was capable of achieving. Because procedures had changed to prevent other talented people from being overlooked. Because the next time someone dismissed a colleague as too small, too inexperienced, too outside the conventional model, there would be institutional memory of what happened when those assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. She got into her car and drove toward her apartment, already thinking about the next operation, the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove that the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate someone who knows exactly what they're capable of. The officer they called Cupcake had left the building. Lieutenant Iris Clark, intelligence officer and operational specialist, had taken her place. And the silver stars she wore openly now told everyone exactly who she'd been all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.